The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot of Clearwater Pharmacy as James Martinez pulled his old pickup truck into a spot near the entrance. The engine made a familiar rattling sound before falling silent. James sat for a moment, checking his wallet one more time. $37 and some change. It would have to be enough for his medications. At 62 years old, James carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 25 years of military service. His graying hair was still cut military short, and despite wearing a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, there was something unmistakably disciplined about his posture. The limp in his left leg, a souvenir from his second tour in Afghanistan, had gotten worse over the past few months. James had been coming to Clearwater Pharmacy for the past 3 years, ever since moving to this small Texas town to be closer to his daughter Sarah and her family. The previous pharmacist, Mr. Chun, had always been respectful and understanding when James sometimes had to ask about generic alternatives or payment plans. But Mr. Chun had retired 6 months ago, and the new management had brought a different atmosphere to the place. As James pushed through the glass doors, the air conditioning hit him like a wall of cold air. The pharmacy had been renovated recently, with bright fluorescent lights and gleaming white floors that made everything feel sterile and unwelcoming. Behind the pharmacy counter, he could see 3 staff members, a young man with perfectly styled hair wearing a name tag that read Trevor, a woman in her 30s with blonde highlights named Stephanie, and another younger woman named Ashley, who was filing her nails. James approached the counter, pulling out a crumpled prescription from his shirt pocket. Dr. Rodriguez had increased his pain medication dosage and added a new prescription for his blood pressure. The combination of medications would normally cost him around $55, but he hoped they might have a generic alternative for one of them. "Excuse me," James said politely, placing the prescription on the counter. "I'd like to fill this, please." Trevor looked up from his computer screen with obvious annoyance, as if James had interrupted something important. He was in his early 20s, wearing designer glasses and a pharmacy coat that looked like it had never seen a busy day. Without saying a word, Trevor snatched the prescription from the counter and glanced at it quickly. "This'll be about an hour," Trevor said dismissively, not making eye contact with James. "Actually," James said carefully, "I was wondering if you might have generic versions available. I'm on a fixed income, and every little bit helps." At this, all 3 staff members seemed to perk up, exchanging glances that James couldn't quite interpret. Stephanie stopped what she was doing and moved closer to the counter, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "Fixed income," she repeated, loud enough for other customers to hear. "Let me guess, another one of those disability cases?" James felt his cheeks redden, but maintained his composure. "I'm a military veteran, ma'am. I served my country for 25 years. The reaction was not what James expected. Instead of the usual respect, or at least neutral acknowledgement he typically received when mentioning his service, Trevor actually laughed out loud. "Oh great, another military hero," Trevor said sarcastically, making air quotes with his fingers. "Let me guess, you probably tell that story to get discounts everywhere you go." Ashley joined in, looking up from her nail file. "Yeah, and I bet you expect us to thank you for your service too, right?" James stood frozen, unsure how to respond. In all his years of military service, and the time since, he had never encountered such blatant disrespect. He had faced enemy fire, buried friends, and carried wounds both visible and invisible from his service, but he had never imagined that asking for help with medication costs would result in public humiliation. Other customers in the pharmacy had begun to notice the commotion. An elderly woman picking up her heart medication shook her head in disgust, while a young mother with a sick child looked uncomfortable and tried to distract her daughter from the scene. "Sir," James said, his voice steady despite his rising anger, "I simply asked about generic alternatives. There's no need for this kind of treatment." But Trevor was just getting started. He had found an audience now, and seemed to be enjoying himself. "You know what? I'm so tired of you military types thinking the world owes you something. You signed up for the job, you got paid for it, and now you want special treatment for the rest of your life. Stephanie nodded in agreement, crossing her arms. Exactly. And half the time, you probably didn't even see any real action. You were probably sitting behind a desk somewhere, and now you want everyone to treat you like some kind of hero. The words hit James like physical blows. He thought of his friend Marcus, who didn't make it home from their second deployment. He thought of the young soldiers he had mentored, some of whom were still fighting their own battles with invisible wounds. He thought of the flag that had been presented to his wife's parents when she passed away from cancer while he was deployed, unable to be by her side in her final moments. I understand you may have had a long day, James said, his military training helping him maintain control, but I've been a customer here for 3 years. I've always been respectful and paid my bills. I'm just asking for the same courtesy in return. Trevor leaned across the counter, getting uncomfortably close to James. Well, maybe you should find a pharmacy that gives military discounts, because we don't feel like playing along with your sob story today. The pharmacy fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft beeping of medical equipment. James looked around and saw that every eye in the place was on him. Some customers looked sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, but no one spoke up. James felt something break inside him, not from anger, but from a deep sadness that his country could produce young people who held such contempt for those who had served. He had fought for their right to speak freely, even if they used that freedom to mock him. I see, James said quietly, taking his prescription back from the counter. I'll take my business elsewhere. As he turned to leave, he heard Ashley make one final comment. Don't let the door hit you on your way out, hero. James walked slowly toward the exit, his limp more pronounced as emotion and stress took their toll on his injured leg. Just as he reached the door, he nearly collided with a man in a crisp military uniform who was entering the pharmacy. The name tag read Colonel William Hayes, U.S. Army. Excuse me, sir, the colonel said politely, then paused as he noticed James's obvious distress. Are you all right? James looked into the younger man's eyes and saw genuine concern. For a moment, he considered just walking away, avoiding any further confrontation. But something in the colonel's bearing, the respect in his voice, made James pause. I'm fine, Colonel, James said softly. Just had an interesting experience with customer service. Colonel Hayes studied James's face more carefully, noting the military bearing despite the civilian clothes, the way he addressed him by rank, the barely controlled emotion in his eyes. May I ask what happened, sir? The colonel asked, and something in his tone suggested this was more than casual curiosity. James glanced back toward the pharmacy counter, where Trevor, Stephanie, and Ashley were watching the exchange with obvious amusement, clearly thinking the confrontation was over, and they had won. Let's just say, James said carefully, that some people in this town don't have much respect for military service. Colonel Hayes followed James's gaze toward the pharmacy counter, taking in the scene with the calculating eyes of a career military officer. He had dealt with enough personnel issues and civilian interactions to recognize when something was seriously wrong. Sir, the colonel said formally, would you mind if I asked your name and branch of service? James Martinez, Sergeant Major, retired. 25 years, U.S. Army. The respect in Colonel Hayes's eyes deepened immediately. A sergeant major with 25 years of service was someone who had earned every stripe, someone who had led soldiers and made life and death decisions. Sergeant Major, Colonel Hayes said, and James straightened slightly at hearing his rank spoken with proper respect. I'm here to pick up medication for my mother. Would you mind waiting for me? I have a feeling there's more to this story, and I'd very much like to hear it. Behind a pharmacy counter, Trevor was telling his coworkers how he had put that old fraud in his place, completely unaware that the conversation by the door was about to change everything. Colonel William Hayes walked purposefully toward the pharmacy counter, his polished boots clicking against the tile floor with military precision. At 38, he commanded respect wherever he went, not just because of his rank, but because of the way he carried himself. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident, and his eyes sharp with intelligence. He had spent 15 years in the Army, including 3 combat deployments and had worked his way up through a combination of natural leadership ability and unwavering integrity. As he approached the counter, Trevor immediately straightened up, his cocky demeanor faltering slightly at the sight of the imposing officer. Stephanie quickly tried to look busy, shuffling papers unnecessarily, while Ashley hastily put away her nail file. "Good afternoon," Colonel Hayes said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the pharmacy. "I'm here to pick up a prescription for Martha Hayes." Trevor fumbled with the computer keyboard, his confidence for moments before evaporating under the colonel's steady gaze. Yes, sir. Let me check on that for you." While Trevor searched the system, Colonel Hayes studied the 3 staff members carefully. His years of military service had taught him to read people quickly and accurately. He saw the nervous energy, the way they avoided eye contact, the obvious guilt written across their faces. These were not the reactions of people who had simply had a normal interaction with a customer. "Here it is," Trevor said, his voice noticeably more respectful than it had been with James. "That'll be $18. As Colonel Hayes reached for his wallet, he glanced back toward the entrance where James was still standing, clearly debating whether to stay or leave. The older man's posture told a story that the colonel recognized all too well. He had seen that same defeated look on the faces of good soldiers who had been mistreated by people who should have known better. "Actually," Colonel Hayes said, turning back to the counter, "before I pay for this, I'm curious about something." I couldn't help but notice that gentleman who just left seemed quite upset. He mentioned something about a lack of respect for military service. The blood drained from Trevor's face. Stephanie stepped back from the counter as if trying to distance herself from the conversation. Ashley suddenly found something very interesting to stare at on the floor. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Trevor stammered, but his voice betrayed him. Colonel Hayes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that every military person recognized as dangerous. "Son, I've been in the Army for 15 years. I've led men in combat, and I've dealt with more liars than I care to count. Right now, your body language is telling me that you know exactly what I'm talking about." The other customers in the pharmacy had begun to notice that something significant was happening. The elderly woman who had witnessed James's humiliation stepped closer, clearly wanting to speak up, but unsure if she should get involved. "The gentleman who was just here," Colonel Hayes continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "appears to be a military veteran. He mentioned being treated with disrespect. I want to know exactly what happened." Trevor's hands were shaking slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "Sir, we treat all our customers with respect. If he felt otherwise, maybe he misunderstood something. It was exactly the wrong thing to say." Colonel Hayes's eyes hardened, and when he spoke again, every person in the pharmacy could hear the steel in his voice. "Are you suggesting that a military veteran would lie about being mistreated?" Before Trevor could answer, the elderly woman who had witnessed the incident stepped forward. Her name was Margaret Shun, and she was the widow of the pharmacy's former owner. She had been watching the new staff with growing concern for months, but what she had just witnessed had pushed her beyond her limits. "Excuse me, Colonel," she said in a clear voice. "I saw exactly what happened, and I think you should know the truth." Colonel Hayes turned to face her, his expression encouraging her to continue. "That gentleman served our country for 25 years, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He came in here politely asking about generic medication because he's on a fixed income. These 3, she gestured toward the pharmacy staff, mocked him. They called him a fraud, suggested he was lying about his service, and told him the world didn't know him anything." The pharmacy fell completely silent. Colonel Hayes turned back to the counter, and the look on his face made Trevor take an involuntary step backward. "Is this true?" the colonel asked, his voice deadly quiet. Trevor tried to speak, but found that his mouth had gone completely dry. Stephanie looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Ashley had gone pale and was gripping the edge of the counter. "I asked you a question," Colonel Hayes said, and now his voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. "Did you mock a military veteran for asking about medication costs?" Finally, Ashley broke under the pressure. "We didn't mean anything by it," she blurted out. We just get tired of people trying to get special treatment all the time. The admission hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Colonel Hayes stared at her for a long moment, processing what she had just said. Special treatment, he repeated slowly. You consider basic human dignity to be special treatment. That's not what I meant, Ashley said quickly, tears starting to form in her eyes. Actually, Colonel Hayes said, pulling out his phone, I think that's exactly what you meant. And I think your supervisor needs to hear about this immediately. Trevor found his voice again, panic making him speak faster than he should. Sir, please, we're sorry if there was a misunderstanding. We didn't realize he was really military. Colonel Hayes stopped dialing and looked up with an expression of complete disbelief. You didn't realize he was really military? So you only show respect to veterans when you can verify their service? And what gave you the right to question his service in the first place? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, because there were no good answers. These three young people had revealed themselves to be exactly what Colonel Hayes had suspected. Individuals who had never learned the meaning of respect, sacrifice, or basic human decency. Let me explain something to all of you, Colonel Hayes said, his voice carrying across the entire pharmacy. That man you just humiliated has probably seen and done things you couldn't imagine. He's likely buried friends, missed family moments, and sacrificed his body and peace of mind for this country. When he asks about generic medication, it's not because he's looking for a handout. It's because military retirement doesn't make anyone rich, and medical costs can be overwhelming. Margaret Chin nodded emphatically. He's been coming here for 3 years. Always polite, always pays his bills, never causes any trouble. What you did to him was disgraceful. Colonel Hayes looked at each of the 3 pharmacy staff members in turn. In the Army, we have a saying, respect is earned, but courtesy is given. You failed to show even basic courtesy to a man who earned more respect in 1 day of service than you've shown in your entire careers. Just then, the pharmacy door chimed as another customer entered. It was a young woman in her early 30s with 2 small children. She approached the counter hesitantly, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Excuse me, she said quietly. I'm here to pick up antibiotics for my daughter. Colonel Hayes immediately stepped aside to make room for her, his demeanor shifting to show the courtesy that seemed so foreign to the pharmacy staff. Of course, ma'am. Please go ahead. As Trevor nervously processed the woman's prescription, Colonel Hayes pulled out his phone again. I'm going to call your corporate office, he told Trevor. But first, I want to make sure that veteran gets the respect and service he deserves. He walked toward the entrance where James was still standing, clearly torn between leaving and staying to see how the situation would unfold. Sergeant Major, Colonel Hayes said formally, would you be willing to come back inside? I believe these folks have something to say to you, and I'd like to make sure you get your medication filled properly. James looked past the colonel toward the pharmacy counter, where 3 very frightened young people were waiting to face the consequences of their actions. For a moment, he considered just walking away, taking his business elsewhere, and trying to forget the whole incident. But then he thought about other veterans who might face the same treatment, other people who might not have a colonel to stand up for them. Sometimes, he realized, you had to face uncomfortable situations not just for yourself, but for everyone who might come after you. Yes, sir, James said quietly. I suppose I would. As the 2 men walked back toward the pharmacy counter together, Trevor, Stephanie, and Ashley realized that their comfortable afternoon of mocking customers was about to become something very different indeed. As James and Colonel Hayes approached the pharmacy counter together, the atmosphere in the building was electric with tension. Other customers had stopped their shopping to watch what was unfolding, sensing that something important was happening. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the silence more profound, and the air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. Trevor, Stephanie, and Ashley stood behind the counter like defendants awaiting sentencing. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning understanding that they had made a terrible mistake. Trevor's hands trembled slightly as he tried to appear busy with paperwork. while Stephanie had crossed her arms defensively across her chest. Ashley looked like she might burst into tears at any moment. "Now then," Colonel Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and the weight of his conviction, "I believe you three have something to say to Sergeant Major Martinez." The silence stretched uncomfortably as the three staff members looked at each other, each hoping someone else would speak first. Finally, Trevor cleared his throat and mumbled something barely audible. "I'm sorry, son," Colonel Hayes said sharply. "I didn't hear that. In the military, when we speak clearly and with conviction. Try again." Trevor's face reddened, but he forced himself to look directly at James. "I'm sorry, sir. We were out of line." "Were you?" "Colonel le Prest." "Out of line how, exactly?" The question forced Trevor to confront the specifics of what had happened, rather than hiding behind a vague apology. We made fun of your military service. We suggested you were lying about it. We were disrespectful." James stood quietly, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to let people reveal themselves through their own words and actions. And why was that wrong? Colonel Hayes continued, clearly not satisfied with the superficial apology. Ashley wiped her eyes and spoke up, her voice shaky. "Because you served our country. Because you sacrificed for us. Because we had no right to judge you or treat you badly." It was a better answer, and Colonel Hayes nodded slightly. "Better. But I want you to understand something else. This isn't just about respecting veterans, though that should be a given. This is about basic human decency. Would it have been acceptable to treat any customer the way you treated Sergeant Major Martinez?" "No, sir," all three said in unison, and for the first time, they seemed to genuinely mean it. Margaret Chun, who had been watching the exchange with approval, stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may add something, I've been coming to this pharmacy for 20 years. My late husband owned it before he retired. I've watched how the staff treats customers, and what happened today was not an isolated incident." This revelation clearly surprised Colonel Hayes, who turned to face her with renewed interest. "What do you mean, ma'am?" "I've seen them mock elderly customers who move slowly or ask questions about their medications," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've seen them roll their eyes at people who don't speak perfect English. I've seen them treat anyone who seems vulnerable with contempt. What happened to Sergeant Major Martinez was just the worst example of an ongoing pattern." The pharmacy fell silent again as the implications of Margaret's words sank in. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about a culture of disrespect that had been allowed to fester. Colonel Hayes turned back to the three staff members. "Is this true?" Stephanie, who had been mostly silent up to this point, finally spoke. "We don't mean to be disrespectful. It's just this job is stressful, and some customers are difficult." "Difficult how?" Colonel Hayes asked. "They ask a lot of questions, or they complain about prices, or they don't understand how insurance works," Stephanie explained, not seeming to realize how her words sounded. "So you mock them," Colonel Hayes said flatly. "You make fun of people who are confused or worried about their health or their finances." When he put it that way, the cruelty of their behavior became undeniable. Ashley started crying openly now, not from self-pity, but from genuine shame at what she was hearing about herself. "I never thought about it that way," she said through her tears. "I never realized how mean we were being." James, who had been listening to the entire exchange in silence, finally spoke. "Young lady," he said gently, addressing Ashley, "may I ask you something?" Ashley nodded, wiping her eyes. "Do you have grandparents?" James asked. "Yes, sir. My grandmother lives in a nursing home about an hour from here." "And how would you feel if someone treated her the way you treated me today? If she went to pick up her heart medication and the pharmacy staff mock her for being old or confused or worried about money?" The question hit Ashley like a physical blow. She could picture her grandmother, frail and worried, trying to navigate the complexity of modern healthcare, and the thought of anyone treating her with cruelty was unbearable. "I would be furious," she whispered. "I would want to protect her." "That's right," James said, his voice still gentle but firm, "because she would deserve better. Just like every person who walks through that door deserves better. Trevor, who had been listening to this exchange, suddenly understood something that had never occurred to him before. You're somebody's grandfather, aren't you? James smiled sadly. I am. I have 3 grandchildren, and when they're old enough to understand, I'll have to explain to them why some people in their grandfather's own country thought it was funny to mock him for serving in military. The impact of this statement was profound. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. These were real people with real families who had been hurt by thoughtless cruelty. Colonel Hayes, who had been watching this conversation with growing respect for James's handling of the situation, decided it was time to address the practical consequences. Now, he said, Sergeant Major Martinez came here to fill a prescription. I want to see that happen, and I want to see it done with the respect and courtesy that every customer deserves. Trevor nodded quickly and turned to his computer. Yes, sir. Sergeant Major Martinez, let me look up your prescription again. As Trevor worked, Colonel Hayes continued. I also want to see a full accounting of the generic options available, any discounts that might apply, and I want to make sure the Sergeant Major gets the best possible price. Actually, a new voice said from behind them. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed man in his 50s approaching the counter. His name tag identified him as David Richardson, the pharmacy manager. I couldn't help but overhear the conversation, David said, his expression serious. Colonel, Sergeant Major Martinez, Mrs. Chun, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. Colonel Hayes studied the manager carefully. Were you aware of how your staff has been treating customers? David's face reddened slightly. I had some concerns, but I didn't realize the extent of the problem. I've been spending most of my time in the back office dealing with insurance companies and suppliers. I can see now that I should have been paying more attention to customer interactions. That's right, Margaret Chin said firmly. A fish rots from the head down. If your staff doesn't understand the importance of treating people with dignity, that's a failure of leadership. The criticism was harsh, but fair, and David accepted it without defensiveness. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Chun, and I want to make this right. He turned to James. Sergeant Major Martinez, first, please accept my personal apology. Second, your medications today are on the house. Third, I want to offer you a permanent 30% discount on all your prescriptions. James looked surprised. Sir, that's very generous, but I don't want charity. It's not charity, David said firmly. It's recognition of your service and an acknowledgement that we failed to treat you properly. It's also an investment in ensuring that you'll give us another chance to earn your business. Colonel unapologetically. That sounds fair, Sergeant Major. What do you think? James considered for a moment, then extended his hand to David. I think that sounds like a good start. As they shook hands, Colonel Hayes turned his attention back to Trevor, Stephanie, and Ashley. Now, as for you 3, what are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? It was Trevor who answered first, and for the first time since the incident began, he sounded like he truly understood the gravity of what had occurred. We're going to remember that every person who comes in here is somebody's family member. We're going to treat them the way we'd want our own families treated. And we're going to remember that respect isn't something people have to earn from us. It's something they deserve just for being human. It was exactly the answer Colonel Hayes had been hoping to hear. As the tension in the pharmacy began to ease, David Richardson, the manager, took charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone who understood that real change required concrete action, not just words. Trevor, Stephanie, Ashley, he said, his voice carrying a new authority that hadn't been present before, I want you to step into the back office with me after we finish serving these customers. We're going to have a very serious discussion about customer service standards and what it means to work in healthcare. Colonel Hayes, meanwhile, had been observing the entire interaction with the calculating mind of a career military officer. He had seen enough personnel situations to know that real change required follow-through, not just dramatic moments of realization. Mr. Richardson, the colonel said, I appreciate what you're doing here, but I have to ask, what's your plan to ensure this kind of treatment doesn't happen to other customers? Because from what Mrs. Chun has told me, this isn't an isolated incident. David nodded grimly. You're absolutely right, Colonel. I can see now that I've been so focused on the business side of running this pharmacy that I've neglected the human side. That change is starting today. He turned to address not just the staff behind the counter, but also the customers who had gathered to witness the confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone here to know that what happened today was completely unacceptable. We serve this community, and every person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Margaret Chun stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had watched the community pharmacy transform over the years. David, your predecessor, understood that a pharmacy isn't just a business. It's a place where people come when they're worried about their health, when they're scared, when they're vulnerable. Mr. Chun never forgot that. Mrs. Chun is right, David said, and James could see that the manager was genuinely grappling with the reality of what had been happening under his watch. A pharmacy should be a place of healing, not humiliation. Ashley, who had been quietly crying during much of the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Richardson, I want to say something. David nodded for her to continue. I know saying sorry isn't enough, Ashley said, her voice still shaky but more determined now. I keep thinking about my grandmother and how I would feel if someone treated her the way we treated Sergeant Major Martinez. I don't want to be that kind of person. I want to do better. Colonel Hayes studied the young woman's face carefully. His years of military service had taught him to distinguish between genuine remorse and empty words meant to avoid consequences. What he saw in Ashley's expression convinced him that her emotion was real. What would doing better look like? The colonel asked. Ashley thought for a moment before answering. It would mean remembering that everyone who comes in here is dealing with something difficult. Being sick is scary. Worrying about money is stressful. Instead of making people feel worse, we should be trying to make their day a little bit easier. That's exactly right, James said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. You know, in the military, we had a saying, service before self. It didn't just mean serving your country. It meant putting the needs of others before your own comfort or convenience. Stephanie, who had been largely silent throughout the confrontation, finally found her voice. Sergeant Major Martinez, I want you to know that I'm ashamed of how we acted. My brother is in the Navy, and if someone treated him the way we treated you, I would be furious. There's no excuse for what we did. The mention of her brother seemed to add another layer of understanding to Stephanie's apology. This wasn't just about abstract concepts of respect. It was personal now. Trevor, meanwhile, had been processing everything he had heard and seen. Sir, he said to James, can I ask you something? James nodded. What made you decide to serve in the military? The question seemed to surprise James, but he considered it carefully before answering. I grew up in a family that didn't have much money. My father worked construction, my mother cleaned houses. When I graduated high school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew I wanted to do something that mattered. The Army gave me purpose, taught me discipline, and showed me what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. Did you ever regret it? Trevor asked. James was quiet for a long moment. There were hard times. I missed a lot of family events. I spent months away from my wife and daughter. I saw things and did things that still keep me awake some nights. But regret it? No. I'm proud of my service, and I'm proud of the young men and women I had the privilege to lead. Colonel Hayes listened to this exchange with growing respect for both men. James for his grace under pressure and his willingness to educate rather than simply condemn, and Trevor for asking the kind of questions that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand. Sergeant Major, the colonel said, I want you to know that your conduct here today reflects the best traditions of military service. You've shown more patience and wisdom than these young people had any right to expect. Thank you, Colonel, James replied. But I think everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing. David Richardson, who had been listening to this entire exchange, stepped forward with a piece of paper in his hand. Sergeant Major Martinez, I've been thinking about what happened here today, and I want to propose something. He handed James the paper. This is a formal letter of apology from the pharmacy. But more than that, I want to offer you a position as a customer service consultant. Part-time, paid position where you would help train our staff on how to treat customers with dignity and respect. The offer clearly surprised everyone, including James. Colonel Hayes raised an eyebrow, impressed by the manager's creative thinking. "You want to work here?" James asked. "After what happened today, especially after what happened today," David said firmly. "You've shown incredible grace and wisdom in how you've handled this situation. You understand what it means to serve others, and you know how to teach by example rather than through intimidation. Our staff could learn a lot from you." Margaret Shin clapped her hands together approvingly. "That's brilliant, David. Who better to teach respect and service than someone who's dedicated his life to both?" Ashley looked up with obvious interest. "Would you really consider working with us, Sergeant Major Martinez, even after how he treated you?" James looked around the pharmacy, taking in the faces of the people gathered there. He saw shame in the young staff members, but also a genuine desire to do better. He saw respect in the eyes of Colonel Hayes and approval from Margaret Shun. He saw an opportunity to turn a painful experience into something constructive. "I'm 62 years old," James said thoughtfully. "I've been retired for 7 years, and to be honest, I've been looking for ways to stay useful. If you're serious about making changes, and if you really think I could help, then yes, I'd be interested in discussing it." The transformation in the atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a confrontation about disrespect had evolved into a conversation about redemption and positive change. Colonel Hayes looked at his watch and realized he needed to get back to base, but he was reluctant to leave before seeing this through to its conclusion. "Mr. Richardson," the colonel said, "I want to make sure you understand that I'll be following up on this situation. I expect to hear that the changes you're promising here today are actually implemented." "Absolutely," Colonel David replied. "In fact, I'd welcome periodic check-ins from you. Accountability is important." As the formal confrontation drew to a close, the various participants began to process what had just occurred. A routine prescription pickup had become a watershed moment for everyone involved, a stark reminder that actions have consequences and that respect is not optional in civilized society. But the most important transformation was yet to come, as the lessons learned in these crucial minutes would be tested in the days and weeks that followed. 3 months later, the transformation of Clearwater Pharmacy was evident to anyone who walked through its doors. The same bright fluorescent lights illuminated the space, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where once there had been indifference and occasional hostility, there was now genuine warmth and professionalism. James Martinez arrived for his regular Tuesday morning shift as customer service consultant, his limp barely noticeable as he moved with renewed purpose. At 62, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of mission that reminded him of his military days, but without the stress and danger of deployment. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," Ashley called out cheerfully as he entered. She had been the first of the 3 staff members to fully embrace the changes, and her transformation had been the most dramatic. The young woman who had once filed her nails while mocking customers now approached her work with genuine care and enthusiasm. "Good morning, Ashley," James replied, hanging up his light jacket behind the counter. "How was yesterday afternoon after I left?" "Really good," she said proudly. "We had an elderly gentleman who was confused about his insurance coverage, and instead of getting frustrated, Stephanie sat down with him and explained everything step by step. He left here smiling and thanking us." James nodded approvingly. These were the kinds of stories that had become routine over the past 3 months, but he never tired of hearing them. Each positive interaction represented a complete reversal from the culture that had existed before. Trevor approached from the pharmacy section, carrying a clipboard with the day's schedule. His appearance had changed significantly since the confrontation 3 months earlier. Gone were the designer glasses and perfectly styled hair, replaced by a more professional but approachable appearance. More importantly, his attitude had undergone a complete transformation. "Sergeant Major," Trevor said, "we have Mrs. Patterson coming in at 10 for her diabetes medication consultation. She's still struggling with a new insulin regimen her doctor prescribed." "Perfect," James said. That'll be a good opportunity for you to practice your patient education skills. Remember what we talked about regarding medical terminology. Keep it simple, use analogies she can relate to, and always ask if she has questions, Trevor recited. It had taken weeks for him to learn to communicate effectively with customers who weren't familiar with medical jargon, but the effort had paid off in dramatically improved patient satisfaction. Stephanie emerged from the back office where she had been preparing insurance paperwork for customers who would be arriving later. Her transformation had been perhaps the most subtle, but no less important. Where she had once been quick to judge and slow to help, she now took pride in solving complex problems for customers. "Good news," she announced. "I got Mrs. Rodriguez's pain medication approved by her insurance. It took 3 phone calls and 45 minutes of hold time, but we save her almost $200. "Excellent work," James said, and meant it. He had learned that positive reinforcement was just as important with pharmacy staff as it had been with young soldiers. "What did you learn from that experience?" "That persistence pays off," Stephanie replied, "and that sometimes the extra effort we put in can make a huge difference in someone's life." Mrs. Rodriguez started crying when I told her the good news because she was worried about affording her medication. These were the moments that reminded James why he had accepted David Richardson's unexpected job offer. What had started as an attempt to address one terrible incident had evolved into something much larger. A complete cultural transformation that was affecting the lives of hundreds of customers. The pharmacy's front door chimed, and Margaret Chen entered, moving slowly but purposefully. At 78, she had become an unofficial quality control inspector for the pharmacy, dropping by regularly to observe how customers were being treated and offering feedback when asked. "Good morning, Mrs. Chun," all 4 staff members said in unison, and James smiled at the genuine warmth in their voices. "Good morning, everyone," Margaret replied, making her way to the consultation area where James held his weekly customer service training sessions. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Never," James assured her. "Your perspective is always valuable." As Margaret settled into a comfortable chair, David Richardson emerged from his office with a folder full of papers and a satisfied expression on his face. "Perfect timing, everyone," David announced. "I just got off the phone with our corporate customer satisfaction survey team. Our scores for this quarter are the highest they've been in 5 years." The news was met with genuine celebration from the staff. More than just job security, high customer satisfaction scores represented validation that their efforts to change had been successful. But more importantly, David continued, "I got a call yesterday from Colonel Hayes." Everyone's attention focused immediately on the manager. Colonel Hayes had become something of a legendary figure in the pharmacy, the catalyst who had forced them to confront their failures and begin the process of change. The colonel wanted me to know that he's been getting feedback from other military families in the area about their experiences here. Apparently, word has spread in the veteran community that Clearwater Pharmacy is a place where military families are treated with respect and understanding. James felt a warmth spread through his chest. Recognition from the veteran community meant more to him than any corporate satisfaction score. "In fact," David said, pulling a letter from his folder, "we received this yesterday." He cleared his throat and began reading. "Dear Mr. Richardson and staff, I want to thank you for the exceptional care you provided to my grandfather last week. As a Desert Storm veteran struggling with PTSD and multiple medications, he often feels anxious about dealing with medical personnel. Your staff's patience, respect, and genuine concern made what could have been a stressful experience into a positive one." My grandfather specifically mentioned James Martinez, who took time to listen to his concerns and help him organize his medication schedule. "It's clear that your pharmacy understands the unique challenges faced by military families. Thank you for your service to our community." The letter was signed by Captain Sarah Williams, U.S. Air Force. Ashley wiped away a tear, clearly moved by the recognition. "I remember her grandfather. He was so worried about mixing up his medications. We spent almost an hour with him, making sure he understood everything. And that's exactly what we should be doing," James said. "Taking whatever time is necessary to make sure people feel heard and helped." Trevor looked thoughtful. "You know, Sergeant Major, 3 months ago, I would have been annoyed by a customer who needed that much attention. I can't believe how different my attitude is now. That's because you've learned something important, James replied. Customer service isn't about processing transactions efficiently. It's about treating people with dignity and helping them solve problems. The efficiency comes naturally when you focus on the person instead of the process. The morning continued with its usual rhythm of customers, prescriptions, and consultations. But there was something different about each interaction, a quality of attention and care that transformed routine transactions into meaningful human connections. Around noon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Colonel Hayes entered the pharmacy in civilian clothes, clearly off-duty, but carrying himself with the same military bearing that had commanded respect 3 months earlier. Colonel, Ashley called out happily. It's so good to see you. The warmth of her greeting would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier, and Colonel Hayes smiled at the transformation he witnessed. Good afternoon, everyone, the colonel replied. I was in the area and wanted to stop by to see how things are progressing. James approached with a genuine smile. Colonel, it's always a pleasure. I hope your mother is doing well. She's doing very well, thank you. And she specifically asked me to tell you how much she appreciates the care she receives here. You made a real difference in her experience. The two men stood together, looking around the pharmacy that had become something neither had expected 3 months earlier. Where once there had been conflict and disrespect, there was now cooperation and genuine care. Sergeant Major, Colonel Hayes said quietly, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here goes far beyond customer service training. You've created a model for how people should treat each other, military and civilian alike. James considered the comment carefully. I think what we've really done is remember something that should never have been forgotten, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. As the afternoon wore on, the pharmacy continued to serve its community with a kind of care and respect that had once seemed impossible. Trevor helped an elderly man understand his insurance benefits without a trace of impatience. Stephanie called 3 different doctors' offices to resolve a prescription conflict for a worried mother. Ashley spent 20 minutes helping a teenage girl understand her acne medication and boosting her confidence in the process. At the end of the day, as the staff began closing procedures, David Richardson gathered everyone together for their weekly reflection meeting. I want each of you to think about one customer interaction from this week that made you proud, David said. Not because it was easy or profitable, but because you made a difference in someone's life. It was a ritual that James had suggested, borrowed from military after-action reviews, but focused on positive outcomes rather than problems to be solved. Trevor spoke first. Yesterday, I helped a veteran's widow understand her husband's leftover pain medication and connected her with a disposal program. She was worried about having dangerous drugs in her house, but she didn't know what to do with them. She hugged me when she left. Stephanie followed. I had a customer who couldn't afford her blood pressure medication, even with insurance. Instead of just telling her the price, I researched manufacturer discount programs and found one that cut her cost in half. She cried with relief. Ashley's contribution reflected her growing confidence and skill. A teenage boy came in with his first antidepressant prescription. He was embarrassed and scared about taking medication for mental health. I talked to him about how common depression is and how brave he was for getting help. I think I helped him feel less alone. James listened to these stories with the pride of a teacher watching students exceed expectations. More than that, he felt the satisfaction of knowing that a terrible experience had been transformed into something genuinely positive. You know, he said to the group, 3 months ago, I walked into this pharmacy as a customer looking for basic respect. Today, I'm proud to work alongside people who understand that respect is just the beginning. You've learned to provide genuine care. As the lights dimmed and the pharmacy closed for the evening, James reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him here. A chance encounter with disrespect had led to a purpose he never could have imagined. Teaching young people that service to others was not just a job requirement, but a fundamental aspect of human dignity. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that respect and care were not old-fashioned concepts, but timeless values that made communities stronger. And in a small pharmacy in a Texas town, for people who had once thought customer service was about processing transactions, had learned that it was really about honoring the humanity in everyone who walked through their doors.